I'll begin by welcoming you to another seminar of the 2020 Monash Biomedical Imaging Webinar Series. I'm Associate Professor Michael Farrell, and I'll be your host. I wish to acknowledge the people of the Kulin Nations on whose land Monash University is positioned. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. On a housekeeping matter, questions for our speaker can be submitted via the Q&A facility, and answers to your questions will be provided at the conclusion of our speaker's presentation. And now it's my honour to introduce our speaker, who is Professor Antonio Verdejo-Garcia, who's a member of the School of Psychological Sciences and the Turner Institute for Brain and Mental Health at Monash University. Antonio received his PhD from the University of Granada, and he subsequently held postdoc positions at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, the University of Cambridge, and the Institute Hospital near the Sea of Medical Investigations in Barcelona, where he prosecuted his research agenda in the field of addiction neuroscience. Antonio then took up an academic appointment at his alma mater before joining the faculty at Monash University in 2012. Antonio's success in his field has been recognised through the award of a Future Fund Clinical Researcher Fellowship, which he currently holds. He's been highly productive, publishing in excess of 200 peer-reviewed, frequently cited papers, and he's regularly attracted financial support for his research from the peak funding bodies, including the NIH and MRC. And so it's with great pleasure that I now invite Antonio to speak to us about obesity and the craving brain. Over to you, Antonio.
Well, then, thank you very much, Michael, for this really kind presentation. I always start this presentation just by saying that most of the time I am an addiction researcher. And then in the context of addiction and the neurobiology of craving and substance use disorders, we've been interested in a number of regions in the brain, including these three that I'm going to be highlighting today. The first one is the striatum, which is one of the core regions in what we call the reward circuit. And it is very important to tell us what is significant, what is important out there, and what are the things that we want to pursue and obtain. A second region that we were always very interested in is the insula, which is a very interesting region. Is the region in the brain that is most interested about the body. It's very interested in everything that is happening in the body, and every meaningful bodily change is kind of read and interpreted in a way that it can inform the generation of emotions, and it can inform decision-making systems. And then we have, of course, the prefrontal cortex, which is a massive region, really functionally diverse. And today I'm going to be talking about specifically these two areas, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which is a really key region for decision-making, and the anterior cingulate cortex, in which we have some areas that are more important for emotional significance and some others that are more important for cognitive control. And what happened is that at some point in my career, it became evident that these systems that we had been investigating in the context of addiction, the reward system, the interoceptive system, and the decision-making system, became relevant to try to understand a little bit better what was happening with the impressively increasing number of people having excessive weight problems. And I think like one of the reasons is that now we have a wide access to a lot of different foods, and specifically we have wide access to foods that are very energy dense, and that they are presented and marketed in a way that they can, let's say, entice the reward system even when we don't need them from a physiological or even from an interoceptive perspective, if you think about it. So you can feel attracted to these foods even if you're not feeling hungry at the moment. And they even promote things like habit formation. So for example, in this marketing, you can see that you have a burger for every day of the week. So you don't have to think anymore. You just have to eat a burger every day. So just to summarize, like we found a number of parallels with obesity in which these regions, the striatum, could be considered to be really important for the increased motivation for food reward that you could find in people with obesity. The insula could be important in terms of having a disrupted perception of some interoceptive feedback, like for example, the signals that come from the body around your hunger or your satiety. And then the VMPFC and the anterior cingulate cortex that could be potentially interesting to try to understand alterations in decision making and the consistent food choices related to food that is maybe rewarding in the short term, but can be associated with very negative long-term health consequences. So today, because it's a relatively short presentation, I'm going to be telling you the story, two different stories, the story about the striatum or the reward system, and a second story about the VMPFC or the decision-making system. Just to give an example of the type of studies that I will be presenting here is like, you can see the characteristics of the sample that we used in this study. So we essentially had a clinical group of people with excessive weight. In this case, it was split into subgroups, people with overweight and people with obesity. And then we have a comparison group that has normal weight, but it's still matched to the overweight and obese group in all the social demographic characteristics, including age, sex, education, and socioeconomic status, that, as you know, is an important variable in the context of obesity. And then we will be comparing this group on different these groups in different neuroimaging measures. So in this experiment, we use this food reward task. It's a very simple paradigm in which we were presenting visual cues of food, in this case, energy-dense, highly appetizing food like this cheesecake. It's not as good as the Cheesecake Factory ones, but it's decent. And then we were giving people some time to think about how much would they pay for that particular food item. And it's not that we were very interested in how much they wanted to spend in the food, but it was a way to engage the valuation system in the brain. So the type of regions that we wanted to see activated and recruited in this context. And then we made a very simple contrast in which we were studying what were the differences in activation between the cheesecake and things like broccoli and kale. People say they like it, but let's say that they don't have the same power in terms of stimulating the brain's reward system. It comes down to a question of energy content. And here you can see the pattern of activation that we observe. So on top, you can see the activation in the whole sample. And you could see essentially that the manipulation did the trick, and you could see activation all over the reward system from the midbrain to the striatum to the medial prefrontal cortex. And probably the group comparisons are better represented in the scatter plots in here, in which you can see how there was a linear relationship between BMI and activation in different regions of the reward system. Specifically, if you take the striatum, you can see how both for the ventral striatum, which is more related to reward and motivation, and the dorsal striatum, which is more related to the formation of habits, you see a linear relationship between BMI and activation in the task. And then one question that came after that is, okay, is this something that is specific to food? Or is this something that reflects kind of a general hypersensitivity to reward? And to try to figure out that, what we did was using a task of monetary reward, being money an example of a generalized reinforcer that everybody recognizes. So we were using this monetary incentive delay task. And again, like comparing people with excessive weight and people with healthy weight. So you can see again on top what was the activation in the whole sample, and you can see again that the manipulation did the trick of activating the reward circuit as we were interested in. But then there was something unique in this contrast. You can see the pairwise comparisons here, but again, like if you look at the figures on the right, it's probably going to be more interesting. Essentially, what you see is that there is an inverted U-shape distribution in which people with overweight seems to show hyperactivation to monetary rewards. But in the case of people with obesity, you can see hypoactivation in the same regions. So essentially, hypersensitivity to reward is specific of food stimuli in the case of people with obesity. And actually, they have blunted activation of the reward system towards other type of reinforcers. And we have shown this with money, and we have shown this as well with social rewards. We did as well some connectivity analysis during the tasks. We did this topology analysis in collaboration with Alex Ronido's group. And I think bottom line of this analysis is that, again, we found a dissociation between the connectivity in the network that reacts to food reward and the connectivity in the network that reacts to monetary reward. And we found as well that BMI interacts differently with these two different networks. And actually, we found that the food reward network is characterized in obesity by decreased connectivity between the frontal cortex, striatal regions, and insular regions. So we come back to the same neurocircuitry that I was highlighting at the beginning when I was talking about addiction. And then, like the second story that I will tell you about today is about the decision-making system. I think after these experiments, we were interested in mimicking this type of conflict that we experience in day-to-day life. And I think, like, probably even more so now that we're in lockdown and we have access to everything that is in the fridge. If there is something in the fridge, sometimes it's not. But it's this conflict about the possibility of choosing things that are healthier for us, and they can be nice as well, don't take me wrong. But then we have another option that is probably more rewarding in the short term, even though we know that it's associated with not so good consequences in the long term. So we wanted to mimic that type of conflict between healthy and unhealthy foods. And we wanted to do it with actual physiological stimuli rather than visual cues, as we have done in the past. And we wanted to understand as well whether the homeostatic state of the person doing the task was important. So how did it change in fasting and satiety and according to BMI? So that's when we came with this new machine that we call the choice castometer. And essentially the task allows us to do different type of decision-making experiments. And for example, in this one, essentially we were putting people to make choices between some beverages that were healthy in terms of low energy density and some beverages that were unhealthy in terms of high energy density. And then people can choose from the remote control, and then we can deliver a small dose, so no choking, no super MBI to my group, and in a safe way, in a way that people can experience the consequences of their choices in real time. Just for you to follow me in these results, essentially in this contrast, we were comparing these type of conflicted choices when people have to choose between a healthy and an unhealthy item, and decisions that were not conflicted in the sense that they were like choices between an unhealthy and an unhealthy one, or between a healthy and a healthy one. So it's essentially capturing that conflict between unhealthy and healthy options. And here you could see the task activation in the whole sample. And we were very happy to see that we had activation both in the anterior and posterior cingulate cortices, like probably reflecting the conflict, both at the level of the task stimuli and also at the level of the inner experience. And we also had activation in, you cannot see it here, but you have to believe me, in the insula and the hypothalamus, that are very important regions for food choices. But we were very interested in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex as kind of the stock market panel of the brain that can tell us how the brain is valuing those different options and how it's making these type of choices in the context of the relative value of the unhealthy versus the healthy options. And again, we were happy to see that actually when we masked the VMPFC, we could see VMPFC activation was modulated both by hunger state, which makes sense because when you're hungry, there is like food has greater value, and probably these decisions are harder to make, and also a modulation by BMI. So that means that people with excessive weight had increased activation of the VMPFC when they were making these type of choices. And again, there was an interaction between hunger and BMI. The other cool thing that we found is that when we analyzed the connectivity of the VMPFC, when people were making these decisions, we found that in people with obesity, there was reduced connectivity between the VMPFC and the hypothalamus. So during the time that they were making that type of conflicted decisions, there were less information sharing between the homeostatic system that monitors your energy needs and the valuation system that is making those type of decisions. Ideally, you would want those two systems to be communicating well. So I guess that took us to the question, okay, can we do something about this? Like, can we try to retrain the food choices of people with obesity? And again, we came back to to our addiction background, and we chose to try to test this intervention that we showed that was effective in addiction. Is an attentional bias modification intervention that essentially trains you with a joystick to push away alcoholic drinks like your Victoria Bitter, if someone still drinks that, and to pull towards yourself alternative drinks that could be water, juices, or sodas. So we had shown in this study in 2016 how this training can effectively reduce alcohol use in people with alcohol dependence and can reduce relapse. We have replicated this now in a sample of 300 people, and that is in the way to publication now. And we wanted to do the same with energy-dense food choices. Rather than doing with the good old joystick, we did it with an app, and that meant that people could train when they were at home or in public transport or whatever. And we found that after 10 days of this type of training, we were able to shift some of those food choices towards healthier options. So again, this was an interesting finding because it's a relatively simple manipulation with a short time exposure, and it's able to achieve some meaningful changes. And we also wanted to see whether that generated some type of changes in the way that the brain engaged with the gastometer task. And this is very preliminary. It is just in 5 people that did the training, but we found that in the post-training administration compared to the pre-training one, we could see that they had increased ACC activation during the conflicted choices, which you could interpret, although this is very, very preliminary. That means that probably they got increased cognitive control over those choices. So now what we've been doing is just testing and trying different prototypes to try to improve the approach bias modification training and to apply it with different devices, including the computer, the app, or virtual reality, and how these different formats suit different people, just to try to maximize the potential engagement that this intervention could have. So that's it. I think in summary, today was a little bit of an overview of the neurobiology of obesity according to our findings, and we have found that in people with obesity, there are alterations in the striatum that essentially reflect hypersensitivity to high-calorie food rewards, and that is a very specific hypersensitivity because actually they are hypersensitive to other type of rewards, including monetary rewards that I was showing today and social rewards. I didn't show it today. And we also observe ventromedial prefrontal cortex alterations that are linked to unhealthy food choices in a very similar way to how VMPFC alterations have been linked to persistence of addictive behavior despite negative consequences, and how approach avoidance training adopted from addiction can increase healthy food choices. Thank you very much to everybody, everybody in the group, everybody that is named here. And I would say as well, very especially today that I'm virtually at MBI, to MBI personnel for coping with us and with all of the problems that we bring from time to time with these relatively complex experiments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Antonio. That was an excellent presentation. I'd now invite people to send your questions in. If you'd like to ask Antonio a question, I can relay those. But I have a question I'd like to pose. I'm struck by, I guess, the prevalence of overeating. And this is in contrast to other things that are either rewarding or not, and that have an influence on our internal state and, you know, contribute to our homeostasis more generally. And my interest is much more in drinking behaviour of water. And over drinking is a very rare thing. And by and large, people drink what they drink principally to redress a lack of water. And while that might be a gratifying or rewarding experience at the time, they're unlikely to seek water out in other contexts. Yet there's something about food that seems to be inherently appealing and rewarding, and seemingly irrespective of the ongoing or concurrent homeostatic state. Is there something about the way food is represented in the brain that distinguishes it from other interoceptive experiences, Antonio?
Well, it's a very good question, and kind of triggered an old story on when we were looking for control beverages for our experiment, and very naively we thought about water, and then someone in the team very wisely said, like, no way, water is incredibly rewarding, and it's going to screw up with all the manipulations that you want to do. It is a good question. I wouldn't think that food in itself is represented in a different way, because we know that for both food and water, there's going to be several overlapping and sometimes redundant systems that are going to be processing their reward value, because they are incredibly important for our survival. But I think it's probably about like the overstimulation of the systems that I was highlighting today that is connected with some of the elements of food. And there is debate on what is the thing that is creating that issue. We've been investigating basically energy content, and if you think about it and you transpose it to liquids, you can think about, for example, sugar-sweetened beverages, which is a major contributor to the obesity epidemic. Actually, all of the things that we're discovering here apply to them. Because it's that nutrient sensing and that ability of different nutrient combinations to probably generate that supraphysiological stimulation of the systems that probably contributes to the overeating, or in the case of sugar-sweetened drinks, over drinking of particular food items. So it's not so much about food or drinks in itself. It's probably about specific categories of food and drinks.
Because it is interesting to note, isn't it, that if we ingest an excessive amount of calories, we have the capacity to hang on to them, don't we?
Yeah.
Through fat stores. Whereas when we drink water, anything in excess of need will be fairly quickly excreted. But I have another question for you, Antonio, and this is from one of the members of the audience. And they are wondering if there are similar activation patterns in these regions you've nominated when considering something like video games. And I guess this is a question that broadens the sphere somewhat to addictive behaviour more generally. So do video games push your buttons?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not, let's say that I'm not an expert on that literature, but of course, I mean, like, video games are engineered in a way that they push those patterns, right? Like they incorporate in-game rewards, and those in-game rewards are going to be are going to be stimulating for those systems. They also increase your arousal in certain ways, and they use intermittent reinforcement in certain ways. So maybe you don't find a treasure for a while. I'm sorry, I'm talking about video games from the 80s. Sorry about that. But maybe you don't find a treasure for a while, and then like out of the blue, you find a big treasure. So that is a way as well of enticing these systems. So absolutely. Then the question is to what extent the activation that you generate is within what we consider functional and adaptive, or whether it goes into the maladaptive realm, and that is probably the subject of I mean, specific investigation at the moment.
Right. I have a question from Fahad, who thanks you for your presentation, Antonio, and he was wondering if you could advise how long it would take for the effects of the training by a mobile app to appear in the changes in the brain maps.
Oh, I mean, it is difficult to know. In the research that has been done with the training, they have found out that the dose that we administered, which is around 20 minutes of training every day for about 7 to 10 days, that is enough to create functional changes in the way that you react to those cues. But you also wonder what is the significance and what is the longevity of those findings. I mean, like, we can generate some changes in the brain. It doesn't mean necessarily that those changes are permanent or consistent, or they're going to have a significant impact in daily life behavior. So, for example, with that training, we were able to modify choices and find changes in the brain. We also were able to reduce weight loss, but for example, the weight loss was not to the point that it was clinically significant. So I think like this is still an outstanding question, like how we can modify the training in a way that we can maximize the impact that it generates.
I was quite struck by the outcomes you reported for the functional connections between the hypothalamus and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, and I'd be interested in your interpretation thereof. Presumably, this is where the homeostatic input potentially has less impact on people's behaviour.
That is our current interpretation. So the idea was that let's say that communication breakdown would mean that probably the VMPFC is making decisions without sufficient feedback from the homeostatic system. Now we are progressing with this research, and we're trying to apply more sophisticated connectivity models to try to understand a little bit better how is the interaction between those regions. And maybe if you invite me again next year, I can show a little bit more of that.
Okay.
But that is a current interpretation. That probably it means that those decisions are less based on homeostatic feedback.
Okay. I have another question from one of our attendees. And do we know why the training paradigm is so effective? Is it a matter of increasing the conscious awareness of choice to food options, or a method of habit change, for example, more automatically rejecting poor food choices?
Yeah, I think like there are two hypotheses about how the training may be working, and they somehow reflected in the question already. One hypothesis is that by linking let's say in this case, the energy dense food with the avoidance movement, effectively what you're doing is reducing the reward value of those foods or the salience of those foods. And that is one possibility. The other possibility is that by, let's say, engaging in that type of, as the question kind of implies, that conscious like pull and push type of behavior, you somehow stimulate cognitive control systems that are able to make a better job when you face that type of conflict. So at the moment, we don't have an answer to that question. And probably the more realistic thinking is that there is a little bit of an interaction between both explanations.
Okay, I'm off the top of my head here, but I get a sense of systems that independently and in synergy contribute to food choices fundamentally, and to some extent in obesity, there's the inference that some of these systems may be superseding others in a way that there's a hyperactivity in some instances and a lack of connectivity in others. Do you think there would be any potential to try and manipulate that situation through something like TMS or whatever, given that there are discrete areas, although one wonders if they'd be targetable given their relatively deep nature in the brain?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question, and a question that we've been asking ourselves. And actually, this is one of the reasons I'm super pissed off with COVID, because actually didn't try to about this time to try to do TMS on the VMPFC, because I think one of the findings that is consistent across our studies is that the VMPFC seems to be a really important hub to orchestrate everything that is happening in lower level regions. And we have some new findings with effective connectivity that show how there are some direct and indirect connections between the VMPFC and the hypothalamus. And we have validated that through different animal models and optogenetic manipulation. So we're pretty confident now that by modulating the VMPFC through TMS, we're going to be able to make changes to the circuit, and that is what we will be doing as soon as we can, which I don't know when it is anymore, but as soon as we can. Yes. Everything is in place. We have ethics clearance and the protocol ready. So watch this space.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for that, Antonio. I think there aren't any further questions from our attendees. So it just really remains for me to thank you very much for an excellent presentation and particularly insightful responses to those questions. So thank you very much, Antonio. And I just need to let people know that our next seminar will be a double header. Dr. Ian Harding and Ms. Louisa Salvatore will be presenting a joint session entitled Multimodal and Multi-Site Imaging in Rare Diseases, Spotlight on Friedreich's Ataxia. So I guess that's all about international collaboration to investigate something that doesn't happen very often. And so that session's scheduled for Thursday, the 17th of September at 12:30 p.m. And I look forward to welcoming you again to the Monash Biomedical Imaging webinar series once more. Thank you, Antonio, in the absence of audible applause. And thank you to all of those of you who attended today. And I'll bid you a fond farewell. Goodbye.
Thank you very much. Bye.